and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Let me unpack this verse for a moment. First of all, in verse 12, Paul says, essentially, that the core of the Christian life is obedience to Jesus Christ. Obedience to Jesus. We are called to live our lives in obedience to Jesus, listening to his voice, saying yes to him. Here's a good question for you. Are you obeying Jesus? If you are a follower of Christ, are you listening to him? Are you following him? Are you saying yes to him? Paul says, my dear friends, if you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence. Paul is saying a core piece of discipleship, a core piece of following Jesus in the world is that we live obedient lives, listening to him. After he talks about obedience, Paul names the urgency of obedience, the urgency of following Jesus in this world, and he gives some really important language, some very serious language. After talking about obedience, he says, now continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. With fear and trembling. First of all, note Paul doesn't say work for your salvation with fear and trembling. You can't work for it. It's a gift. Salvation is a gift, pure grace of God, pure love of Jesus. It's a gift. You can't work for it. Paul doesn't say continue to work for your salvation with fear and trembling. He says work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Really, it means to live out your salvation, to express your salvation. But Paul gives a word of the sacredness, the holiness, the importance of our lives before God, the importance of our decisions before God. 4 words, with fear and trembling. The decisions we make, the life we choose to live in following Jesus is a sacred life, a holy life. It requires us to be serious about the decisions we make. And when Paul says fear and trembling, he's not saying in a way that we are afraid of God. He's talking about it in this way. We are to have a holy awe and wonder before God. The decisions you make matter. As a follower of Jesus, the decisions you make are sacred. They are holy. We shouldn't be playing around with them. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Then he goes to verse 13. And Paul gives good news, for it is God who works in you. In the Greek language, there's actually 2 words that it's a word play that Paul is putting together. He's essentially saying this: you are to work at it, your salvation, because God, being able to do so, because God himself is at work. Work it out because God is working in. That's what he's saying. Work it out because God is working in. You don't have to rely on your own resources. God's working in. But you're called to work it out. Which one is it? Yes, it's both. Am I supposed to work it out? Yes. But be of good cheer. God's working in. There's some resources inside of you. God is at work in you. He says, God is at work in you. To will, here's the word, to will and to act in order to do his good purpose. What Paul is saying here is that God, through his presence, God, through his love, God, through his compassion, is working in us at all times, stirring our hearts and our desires to do his will. God's working in you, stirring your heart, stirring your desires to do his will, to will God's purpose. God is working in us. Now, Paul doesn't say through what? He doesn't say how God is working, but it's safe to say that the Holy Spirit addresses all the inner material of our lives, working in all the inner material of our lives to will, to do